All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're basically strapping on our detective hats and stepping right into the shoes of an ISO 14001 lead auditor. We're going to investigate one of the most critical, yet honestly, most misunderstood areas of the standard. And look, this isn't just some boring paperwork exercise. It's a high-stakes case of organizational survival and real environmental responsibility.
So what actually is the most dangerous blind spot in your entire environmental management system? You might instantly think, oh, it's got to be an uncalibrated emissions monitor, or, I don't know, a leaky hazardous waste drum. But no, actually the ultimate systemic failure usually starts way earlier than that. It starts with a missing stakeholder. When an organization fails to see who is truly impacted by their environmental footprint, the entire system is set up for a catastrophic blind spot.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today's investigation. We'll be decoding Clause 4.2 requirements, looking at the core interested parties, translating needs to obligations, auditing register completeness, and finally, spotting some common nonconformances. Let's get into it.
Section 1. Decoding Clause 4.2 requirements. Well, our very first clue in this investigation is understanding that your environmental system simply cannot survive in a vacuum. Right? The official ISO definition of an interested party is a person or organization that can affect, be affected by, or even just perceive itself to be affected by your environmental performance. I like to think of this as your organization's environmental radar. It's not just about who you think matters, it's about literally anyone who interacts with your environmental footprint, from the local community next door all the way up to global regulators.
And the really crucial point here is that Clause 4.2 forces a massive shift in mindset. You're no longer just ticking boxes for compliance. This clause specifically links your organization's context straight to real-world stakeholder expectations. Think about it. If your radar is broken, your management system is just flying blind. It's completely disconnected from the actual environmental pressures and societal expectations happening right outside your doors. It's basically the difference between merely tracking how much water you use and actively knowing about the local drought conditions that your community is deeply worried about.
Moving on to Section 2, the core interested parties.
So we can essentially map our core suspects across four main groups. First, we've got regulatory bodies. They're enforcing those hard legal limits and emissions monitoring. Then we have communities who genuinely care about very noticeable things, right? Like odor control and noise reduction. Next are customers. They're the ones demanding sustainable packaging and doing supply chain audits. And of course, employees, who absolutely require safe handling of hazardous waste. Now just imagine a chemical plant that completely ignores local noise complaints just because they're, technically within their legal limits. If they haven't identified the community as an interested party, wow, they're walking into a massive reputational and operational trap.
To avoid those exact traps, let's just quickly highlight the essential ground rules for mapping these groups out. First, you absolutely must identify relevant parties based on your actual operational context. Look, a software company is going to have vastly different stakeholders than an oil refinery, right? You also need to distinguish between a general expectation and a binding obligation. Oh, and here's a big one. Remember that voluntary pledges, like putting out a press release saying you're going carbon neutral? Well, those become mandatory compliance obligations once you officially adopt them, so you have to continuously scan the horizon. Market and social pressures are always shifting, meaning yesterday's voluntary pledge is literally tomorrow's audit requirement.
All right, Section 3, translating needs to obligations.
So how do we take these kind of abstract needs and make them real? We use what auditors call the traceability thread. Here's how it works. Step 1, identify the interested party. Step 2, determine their specific environmental need. Step 3, define that need as a formal compliance obligation. And finally, Step 4, map that obligation directly to a physical operational control. This right here is exactly how an auditor hunts for gaps. We follow that thread from the initial stakeholder right down to the factory floor. And if a stakeholder expectation doesn't actually connect to a physical control or process somewhere, boom, the thread is broken.
There's a quote from the standard that really just hits the nail on the head here. It says, compliance obligations serve as the foundation for establishing environmental objectives, operational controls, and risk assessments. I mean, think about that. If your foundation is missing just because you missed one stakeholder, the whole system crumbles. Your objectives suddenly become irrelevant, your operational controls are misaligned, and your risk assessments, well, they're fundamentally flawed from the very start.
Which brings us to Section 4, auditing register completeness. You see, a truly complete system relies on this continuous ripple effect. In Phase 1, you analyze the context under Clause 4.1. Now that directly feeds Phase 2, which is your stakeholder identification under Clause 4.2. That then drives Phase 3, your risk assessment under Clause 6.1. And finally, Phase 4, your actual operational control under Clause 8. An auditor is going to use this exact timeline to prove that Clause 4.2 is the vital bridge. If your interested party register is incomplete, that gap ripples straight through the entire timeline, which means your day-to-day operations end up completely disconnected from your initial strategy. Not good.
Let's look at Section 5, Spotting Common Nonconformances.
This right here is the classic showdown, isn't it? The static register versus the dynamic register. Look, a static register is honestly a terrible thing. It gets created once for certification audit, it gets shoved in a filing cabinet somewhere, and it stays completely disconnected from daily environmental risks. But a dynamic register, which is what real effective compliance actually demands, is a living, breathing document. It's updated regularly, it's intrinsically linked to your environmental aspects, and it is highly responsive to changing laws and stakeholder demands.
Let's rapid fire through some of the specific traps we look for in an audit. Relying on outdated legal references? Yeah, that's a huge one. Or overlooking indirect stakeholders, like local communities, as we mentioned earlier. We also very frequently see organizations failing to translate those stakeholder expectations into actual physical controls. And another major nonconformance is disconnecting the register from your real risk management processes. It's kind of like listing a regulatory body on your register, but entirely missing the fact that they issued a specific new emissions permit requirement just last month. That is a critical failure.
So let this takeaway really sink in for a second. An incomplete register undermines the entire environmental management system. It really is that simple. Just a single missing link in your stakeholder analysis can cascade into a massive systemic failure. You aren't just missing a name on a piece of paper, you're missing a real legal requirement, you're missing an operational risk, and you're leaving behind a gaping environmental vulnerability.
And all of that brings us to our final question for this explainer. If an auditor walked into your facility today, right now, and asked to see your interested party register, what would they find? Honestly, would it reveal a dynamic, highly tuned radar capturing every environmental pressure out there? Or would it expose a dangerous systemic blind spot? It's definitely a question worth interrogating your own compliance systems over today. Thanks so much for diving into this investigation with me. I'll catch you next time.